Today we're going to talk about the endocrine system. We will be divided in two parts. The first part we will deal with the pituitary, the different components of the pituitary. We will also talk about the thyroid, the different cells of the thyroid, then the parathyroid. All that will be part one. Part two, we will continue with adrenal, the blood flow in the adrenal, the cortex and medulla, a little bit about the pineal, and then we'll end with the islets of Langerhans that produce insulin. Thank you. The endocrine system, part one. Part one, we want to distinguish between the neurohypophysis and the adenohypophysis, identify the cell types that we see there in the photomicrographs of the pituitary. We also want to identify follicles, follicular cells, colloid, capillaries, and the parafollicular cells in the thyroid. And then finally, with the first part, we want to identify the capsule, chief cells, oxyphils, and the parathyroid. Part two, we will identify adrenal, and then the pineal, as well as the islets of Langerhans. So here we can see the endocrine glands that we'll be talking about, the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the parathyroid gland, adrenal gland, pituitary, and the pancreas. And these are some characteristics of these that we'll be learning along the way. Now, in nervous tissue, you got different nerves, and they innervate different cells. They actually touch the cells and have synapses. And there's receptors on the postsynaptic site that corresponds to the transmitters that these nerves are producing. So one cell touches another cell, and that's a quick response for the cell. However, a more general response would be for the endocrine system. That is, the cells at one location produce hormones that go into the bloodstream, and then they go to distant parts of the body, and then the different hormones have different structures which correspond to different receptors. We see different types of receptors here. So in the endocrine system, you have some cells that produce, the hormone goes into the bloodstream, and then at some distant sites it interacts with other cells which have receptors for that specific hormone. So what you need is receptors on the surface of cells, and sometimes there's intracellular receptors like steroid hormones, carrier proteins, and then they have receptors inside the cell. But a lot of hormones, there are proteins, and they cannot go through the plasma membrane, so you have to have a receptor on the cell surface. And here we can see the hormone interacts with the receptor that's on the cell surface, and that causes a cascade of events, and ultimately cyclic AMP is being produced as a second messenger. So the first messenger would be the hormone, and then inside the cell would be the cyclic AMP. And there's a host of hormones, TSH, ACTH, LH, epinephrine, parathyroid hormone, that uses the second messenger system, that cyclic AMP will cause the same response as these hormones will in the target cells. Now, endocrine means internal secretion, that is without ducts. Endocrine versus exocrine. Exocrine has ducts, endocrine has no ducts. The word hormone, which is what's produced by the endocrine cells, means to arouse or to set in motion. That's what the word hormone means. Now, the endocrine glands are from the endoderm, and we'll talk about that. The epithelial cell parts of the endocrine glands are from the endoderm. And remember about the origin of epithelium, we got the ectoderm, that's where our skin comes from, the sebaceous gland, mammary glands, and the endoderm is where the GI tract comes from, pancreas and intestinal glands. And then we have mesoderm, which has two types of epithelium. One is called endothelium, which lines blood vessels, and mesothelium, which lines cavities that we see there. But the endocrine comes from the endoderm. So you have endoderm giving rise to glands, and they lose their connection with the surface. That is, they lose the duct. They do not have ducts. And here we can see it from the endoderm. A host of these glands, all these glands, come from the endoderm. Adrenal, thyroid, doesn't matter. They come from the endoderm, and they all lose their connections on the surface. Now, if we look at the adenohypophysis, which is the epithelial cell containing part of the pituitary, we can see that actually comes from the oral cavity, and that comes here, and that makes the adenohypophysis, which is a pars distalis, a pars intermediate, and a pars tuberalis. That's the different names. They're different parts of the adenohypophysis, and that arrived from the oral cavity that you see there. You see the pituitary has a nice relationship with the hypothalamus. Here's the hypothalamus, and it's attached to the hypothalamus, and some of the neurons are in the hypothalamus actually come down into the pars nervosa. But the pars distalis here, which is part of the adenohypophysis, it interacts with the vascular supply, as we'll talk about later on. Their neurons do not go all the way, but the hormones go all the way. And so in the pars distalis, right in through there, you have different types of cells. You've got chromophobes that do not like stain, and all we see basically is a nucleus. And then you have chromophils. They like stain. And some stain blue, and some stain red, as we will see a little later on. Now, this is from Wikipedia. There's a website for this where it shows you the development of the pituitary. So this is from the ectoderm, from the surface, and this is from the red is actually from the endoderm. It says ectoderm, it's really endoderm, in through there from the oral cavity. And so you can see the Ralph's pouch goes up in through there. The next step, it separates from the surface of the oral cavity, and that's going to make the adenohypophysis. And then finally, as this developed up, you get the pars distalis. There's the pars distalis right here. Pars tuberalis, the tube that goes around the infundibulum stalk, and the pars intermediate, where you have this colloid and cells associated with that. So the pituitary loses its connections from the surface. This is the oral cavity here, and this is from the brain. And you see you kind of have a binary origin of the pituitary. The nervous tissue comes from the ectoderm. It goes in here, but this is definitely from the endoderm. And it loses its connection to the surface, as I mentioned to you, and hence there's no mechanism for it to be a duct. And here we can see also from Wikipedia the similar type thing. There's adrenal in a 10-week embryo. You can see the adrenal here is developing from the endoderm, and it has now disattached already from the endoderm surface. So what we want to do is appreciate the diversity of functions of the endocrine system. Different things, different hormones are produced, and they cause different reactions to different cells. And they recognize the different organs and unique features of organs and cells that make up the endocrine system. So there's a host of organs that we're going to talk about, and the pituitary being one. Here we see the adrenal. Now the word hormone means to arouse or to set in motion, is what it talks about. And when you look at the physiologic levels of hormones compared to glucose, glucose is 10 to the minus 12 molar. Steroid hormones is 10 to the minus 9. So minute amount of steroid can make a big difference in the individual. Peptide is even more dilute. Peptides is 10 to the minus 12 molar. How many zeros is in 10 to the minus 12 molar? That's a lot of zeros, minute amount. Now, the amount of hormone being produced is tightly regulated. For example, growth hormone, 10 to the minus 13, would make a dwarf. In contrast, 10 to the minus 11th would make a giant. And so the regulation of hormones is very important in terms of the effect of the body on this. Here you can see E.T. was played by a dwarf in some of the scenes. And this guy here is 8 feet 5 inches tall, as you can see, as a giant. Now the pituitary gland is involved in the neuroendocrine system. And how is it done that way? One, it produces 9 hormones. 9 hormones are produced, and it has a reciprocal relationship with other endocrine organs. It produces hormones that stimulate something, then those organs produce a hormone which inhibit that stimulation. And it has a neural and a vascular connection with the brain. So there's neurons that are connected to, and also there's a vascular connection. And also the pituitary is located in the key position, just right under the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus right here, and the pituitary right there, for it to set up the establishment of the neuroendocrine system. So the nervous system tells the endocrine system kind of what to do. And so there's 2 major divisions of the pituitary gland. You've got the adenohypophysis we've already met. It has a pars distalis, the pars tuberalis, and then the pars intermedia. That's right in through here. Also, there's a neural hypophysis, which is a pars nervosa that we see there, infundibulum stalk, and the medium eminence. All this blue here is part of the neurohypophysis, and that's actually nerves. So this comes from the ectoderm, is whenever the pituitary was developed, from the oral cavity here or from the brain in the case of this. And these neurons are up here, and they send their projection down here, as we'll learn. 2 major divisions, adenohypophysis, which is all epithelium type parenchymal cells, and the neurohypophysis, which is nerves and axons. And here we can see that the pars distalis, pars intermedia, pars nervosa, pars tuberalis on the outside, medium eminence, and infundibulum stalk, as we can see. So the pars distalis here and here, pars intermedia here and here, and the pars nervosa, that is basically nervous tissue, even though you do have support cells, the pituocytes, in through here, but they're just support cells. So again, we can see the adenohypophysis as 3 components, and the neurohypophysis that we see in through there. And as I mentioned, it has vascular connections. The adenohypophysis neurons empty onto the bloodstream. So they're empty, releasing factors, releasing hormones onto the bloodstream, and it goes through a portal system down to the cells of the pars distalis. And so this vasculature portal system is unique to the adenohypophysis. In contrast, you have another blood supply that goes to the nervosa. So these hormones don't go over here, they only go down in this side. Now the neurons, which are up in the hypothalamus, they send their axons down here. So really the hormones that are stored in the pars nervosa are really secretions of these nerve bodies themselves. And what are those hormones? You got oxytocin, you have ADH. Those are hormones secreted by the hypothalamus, stored in the pars nervosa. In contrast, on the other side, we have a host of hormones. We have acidophils, produce hormones, and then you have basophils. Basophils produce gonadotropic hormones, thyroid stimulating hormones, and adrenal cortical hormones. So you'll have to know what hormones are produced by each of these cell types. Now here we see a pituitary. It has a little tumor over here. Don't worry about that. for resistant, pars distalis, pars tubosa, pars intermedia, and you can see the colloid kind of follicles there. Infundibulum stalk, median eminence, and this is the pars tuberalis. So this is the adenohypophysis over here, right in through there, and the neurohypophysis on that side. And as I mentioned, the nerves up in the hypothalamus actually send their projections down there and store their hormone, oxytocin, for example, down in this region. In contrast, your neurons here are shorter neurons, and they discharge their releasing hormones in the portal system that goes through to affect the different cell types. And remember, we have chromophobes, we don't know what they do, acidophils and the basophils. And that's what we see here. We can see there's some that are red, there's some that only has a nucleus. We can't see the cytoplasm. Chromophobes, chromophils, either red or kind of bluish in scent, red or blue, acidophils or basophils. Here we can see chromophobes, the basophils, and the acidophils. And here again, that's kind of what we're seeing. The acidophils are kind of reddish ones that we see. They're more darker nucleus, maybe chromophobe, they don't stain. And then you got the basophils as well. So that basophil is different than the basophils you have in the blood that we'll learn about later on. So the basophils, chromophobes, and acidophils. This is in the pars distalis. Now in the pars tubosa, we have the pituitary cells, which are support cells in through there. They're not the axons. They interact with the axons coming down from the hypothalamus. And here we can see those pars tubosa is what we're talking about right now. And if you look at it, you can see the neurons are up in the hypothalamus. They come down in through there and they store their hormone, oxytocin, and antidiuretic hormone. And they store those in what we call herring bodies. And here we can see, which is a swollen portion of the axon, not at the terminal, but along its length, that store those. And we can see those. There's a herring body right there. There's a herring body right there. You can see there's actually granules in it. So here we can see the granules. That's our mag of this one. Herring bodies here and here and here, as we can see, which are the swollen portion of axons which store hormones in the way. And of course, the hormones that we're talking about is oxytocin. And oxytocin is important in smooth muscle contraction during labor, for example. Also, oxytocin is involved in milk ejection for the mammary gland to discharge the milk, and antidiuretic hormone is involved in water absorption in the kidney. So the pituitary, as we can see there, here's up in this region is a tuberalis around the nervous tissue that we see there, and a pars intermedia. And so you can see the kind of cysts that we have there. So this is the pars distalis, pars tubosa, and this is a pars intermedia right in through here. So again, we get the pars intermedia right in through there. They produce like melanocyte stimulating hormone is one of the things that is what they produce. Chromophobes, acidophil, basophils, pituitary, herring bodies is what we can see. So we see the pituitary. This is a pars intermedia, pars tuberalis. Again, I'm not sure why I have two of those. But here we see the thyroid gland. On either side we see a kind of a double backpack, as we can see. And this is a parathyroid that's kind of embedded in there, but this is a thyroid gland that we see there. And we see colloid. Mostly what we see is the pink colloid. This is the thyroid globulin that we see. And we see the follicle. So the follicle is like a group of cells that make some kind of cavity or something. Not necessarily a cavity, but it could be a cavity. In this case, it's a cavity filled with colloid. Also, we can see the kind of hot pink in through there, and that's the red blood cells. So this is blood. This is capillaries rich capillary bed between the follicles. So this is a follicle, colloid in the middle, and the cells in there are the follicular cells. So these are the cells that we see, the follicular cell, that whenever it's thyroid stimulating hormone stimulated, it causes thyroid hormone to be produced. So there's actually an A and B component of these follicular cells. One side they produce colloid, which is what we see, and with iodine, that colloid should be iodinated. If it's iodinated, then it can come in there and it can be broken down to the thyroid hormone. If you don't have iodine, and so iodine is not attached, then it can't break it down on that side, and that may produce a goiter because it's trying to produce more thyroid hormone, even though if it doesn't have iodine, it can't produce. It can produce this, but not that, and so it makes more and more colloid, thinking that's what it needs to do. So we see capillaries, we see follicles, we see follicular cells, we see the colloid. Here's a thyroid, and in between the follicles is the parafollicular, near the follicles. So the parafollicular cells that we see right there. Here we see again, there's another parafollicular cell. These are the follicular cells, colloid, blood vessels, parafollicular cells. Parafollicular cells produce calcitonin. Calcitonin is important in calcium regulation in the body. And that these hormones, two hormones, parathyroid hormone and calcitonin from the parathyroid, they regulate calcium levels such that 1/4 of all free calcium levels in the blood exchange every minute. So it's a tight regulation, and it does that by interacting with bone. So calcitonin produced by the parafollicular cells remove the osteoclast ruffled border, which prevents the reabsorption of bone. So whenever you got bone reabsorption, you have this big cell here, osteoclast. It eats up bone, and it has this ruffled border, which maintains an environment to help dissolve the bone. If you have calcitonin, that removes the border from there, and hence the environment, and so no longer can bone be broken down. So calcitonin reduces calcium levels in the blood. In contrast, we'll learn in a minute that parathyroid hormone stimulates osteoclast. Osteoclasts break down bone, you have elevated levels of concentrations of calcium in the blood. So here we see the thyroid hormone with the parafollicular cells, follicular cells. The parathyroid has many colloid-filled follicles. So these are the different follicles that we see there. Thyroid hormone increases the number and size of mitochondria. So thyroid hormone stimulates the number of mitochondria, and that stimulates mitochondrial protein synthesis, and that helps to enhance carbohydrate metabolism in cells. So by having more mitochondria, you can have more carbohydrate metabolism inside the cell. So here we have a thyroid gland and many colloid-filled follicles, as we see there and all in through here. The parathyroid used to be right in here and here. Here we see the parafollicular cells, follicular cells. And as I mentioned before, we have American secretion of the colloid. The colloid is the thyroglobulin, and then the thyroglobulin is taken in and phagocytized. The lysosome digests some of it, and it actually produces thyroid hormone at the base if it's thyroid stimulating hormone stimulated. So a thyroid gland is associated with diseases because you can accumulate thyroglobulin in iodine deficiency. That's a goiter. As I mentioned, the cells have two functions. They have a side that produces the colloid and a side that breaks it down. This part requires iodine. This does not. So if you have iodine deficiency, you can still produce colloid, and it does so, and that produces a goiter. Also, there's Graves' disease. Graves' disease is a hyperthyroidism, too much, causes IgG with long-acting thyroid stimulation. So it looks like it's TSH in terms of what the effect that it has on the thyroid. So hyperthyroidism, Graves' disease. Now, endocrine secretion can be stored in granules, and we have that in the pituitary. It can be stored extracellular, that is, outside the cell. But in doing so, you have to have a follicle to contain that storage component. So these are the follicular cells. There's a colloid stored. This is in the thyroid. And then also you have immediate release with no storage. And here, and we can see there, this is adrenal. So thyroid, pituitary, and the adrenal. You have lots of smooth endoplasmic reticulum, a lot of mitochondria. There's a nucleus, a little bit of rough ER, and it produces steroid. And steroid, of course, is hydrophobic, and it can walk right through a membrane. And so therefore, what holds these granules there are membranes. And if it can go through the membrane, then it won't hold it. And so there's no storage at all. As soon as it produces testosterone or mineralocorticoids, they're gone there, as we can see. So protein in the cell, a thyroid globulin outside the cell, or the steroid passes through the cell. That brings us to the parathyroid. The parathyroid are embedded in the thyroid, and they have two cells. The principal cell are the chief cells, and that's the one that produces parathyroid hormone. There's also another cell in here, oxyphil, that we see. There they are here. Oxyphils are kind of pink. They have a smaller nucleus and a bigger cytoplasm, and it's very pink. Here we see the oxyphils. There's blood vessels there. The chief cells, which are the principal cells. We don't know what the oxyphils do. They're just there. Here again we see oxyphils, a lot of space between nuclei because the cells are very big compared to the chief cells, as we see here. Also, the chief cells are more bluish than the more reddish color of the oxyphils. Oxyphils, chief cells. And these other guys in here are veins, little venules or veins that we see. So oxyphils, chief cells that we can see. And also, as I was going to mention, a rich vascular supply. So we here have places where we see the capillaries in through there. So these are the chief cells and the oxyphils. And as we mentioned, the chief cells produce the parathyroid hormone, which stimulates osteoclast production. So it makes a lot of cells that eat bone, and that adds to, when it's eating the bone, it adds to calcium levels in the blood. So osteoporosis is due to hyperparathyroidism is one of the causes of it. So if you have too much parathyroid hormone, then you can break down bone too much, and that's osteoporosis. The end of the first slide.